Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off, as we have with many shows over the past week or so, about the U.S. elections and the continuing controversies that is giving a rise to at this point in time, with Donald Trump not accepting the projected results at this point in time. And that is one thing that he and I believe all of his supporters are, honing in on, that word projected, saying that this is not yet the final result on the part of the Electoral College, which I believe will be announced, if I'm not mistaken, around December 14th. Nevertheless, the numbers don't lie, though, right? So it seems that Donald Trump would have an extremely hard time to become president at this point in time and to beat Joe Biden, because he at this point in time, I believe, is projected to have anywhere from 279, I think it is, Electoral College votes to 290. At this time, we also have lawsuits. Donald Trump wants to take this all the way to the Supreme Court, saying that there has been major voter fraud, though the New York Times, I believe it was, reached out to every single state, and none of the states had spoke about fraud within their own state. So that also seems to be something that has not necessarily happened. But what does this mean then for the transition going forward, if that is meant to happen, if that is confirmed on December 14th or by the Electoral College or even by the Supreme Court? What is the next step? Will Donald Trump go peacefully if it is once confirmed that he is not now to become the president-elect once again going forward? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. David Redlawsk, who is a professor of political science and chair of the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Delaware. He's joining us this morning from Newark, Delaware. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Michael Lane, who is the founder of the American Institute for Foreign Policy. Michael and David, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us. David, let me start with you. What do you make of the continuing fallout from these elections, Trump's refusal to accept the projected results?
At the situation that we face right now, simply because the president had indicated all along that he was going to question the results of the election if they didn't turn out the way he wanted them to. But it is really quite clear. President-elect Joe Biden has clearly won or leads in enough states to win the Electoral College. He will win the election popular vote, not that that matters in the United States, by probably more than 5 million votes. He will get more votes than any American presidential candidate has. And I think there's just no path for Donald Trump to really contest this election.
Michael, what are your thoughts about that? Because certainly on Donald Trump's side, everyone is very gung-ho, saying that no, something did go wrong in these elections.
Well, okay, first of all, there's no such thing as an absolutely 100% fair and free election, even here in the United States. There's voter fraud in every election that we've ever had, just about. So if you accept that as a baseline premise, which it's prima facie true, then you look at how much of this went on, and was there enough to change the election? In other words, is the evidence that the Trump campaign will present in court going to be dispositive to the point where the court will overturn what appears to be an election result? Let's divide this into Pennsylvania and non-Pennsylvania. For those of us who are not constitutional lawyers but have a lay reading of the Constitution, it's very clear that collusion between the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and the Pennsylvania governor to just rewrite willy-nilly the rules of the election in Pennsylvania was patently unconstitutional. And if the Supreme Court does its job, it will overturn the Pennsylvania results, and that will go into the Donald Trump column, not even controversially. I mean, it's just that obvious. Then you have the other non-Pennsylvania ones where if President Trump threaded a needle the last time to become elected, the eye of this needle is even much more narrow than it was the last time. And although it is possible, it's extraordinarily unlikely that he will be able to run the table and win litigation in each of the 4 or 5 remaining states that he has his eye on. At the end of the day, I expect that we probably will be looking at President Biden, but President Trump is well within his legal rights to play this out and do what he's doing. It's only been a week so far. I remember we did this for more than 5 weeks back in 2000 when Al Gore contested the election that went to George Bush. We're not under any particular time constraints. Let it play out. Let's count every legal vote and let's see where the chips fall. I suspect they'll fall in Biden's direction, but we need to find out.
David, why then the rush? I know that there's the argument about, listen, we need to get the transition started, and it makes the job that much easier for the next administration if it is, for example, Joe Biden gets confirmed by the Electoral College. But nevertheless, why is there all this pressure on Trump to do something this quickly if he feels that, listen, he does want to fight this out?
Look, I've got to start by saying Michael's living in a complete fantasy when it comes to Pennsylvania. What the United States Supreme Court said was that the late arriving ballots had to be segregated, and the state has segregated those late arriving ballots. They've announced there are no more than about 10,000 of those ballots. Joe Biden's lead in Pennsylvania is far greater than 10,000 votes. Even if those votes were thrown out, they would not change the result in Pennsylvania. There is no question about Pennsylvania. But beyond that, the transition period is a period where the president-elect gets the presidential daily briefings about intelligence issues around the country, begins to put together his cabinet, begins to organize. One advantage that President-elect Joe Biden has is that he was the vice president for 8 years. He understands how the government works. He was a senator for many, many years before that. He's not going to come in cold. Even if the transition is slowed down in some form, I don't think it has the kind of risk it would have if you were bringing somebody in who didn't know a whole lot about what they were doing in the first place. Should also note that so far every single lawsuit that's been filed by Donald Trump has been lost or is still under consideration, and none of them allege enough ballots to make any difference in any of the states. It is a done deal. Now, whether Donald Trump wants it to be a done deal or not is not really relevant at this point. On January 20th, Joe Biden will become president, whether President Trump cooperates or not.
Michael, I wonder, does this not reflect badly on Donald Trump, that he's not willing to go through the transition right now? If, the results, and they are significantly clear at this point in time, and even the numbers, even if we're not just talking about Electoral College and the way that's gone, doesn't it just bode badly on him and his own legacy? Wouldn't it be the more mature thing for him to say, listen, okay, I've lost according to the numbers, and let's move on?
Depends on if he wins or not. If he wins, which I've stipulated is an unlikely event, then he looks very intelligent and forward-thinking, and indeed has done what needs to be done to carry out the will of the American people. If, on the other hand, he loses, then in retrospect, I think your argument, Waqar, holds a lot of water and is very salient. But the president is looking at all of his options. He is well within all his legal and constitutional rights to do 100% of what he's doing. The transition is not suffering at all. David just mentioned that the reason for the transition is to start naming your cabinet and review the policies of the previous administration and to learn the job. And that's irrelevant because the vice president is already naming his cabinet. He named his chief of staff last night. He's been vice president for 8 years and in the Senate for 37 years before that. So he knows the government and he knows the issues. And he articulated in the campaign exactly how he was going to differentiate between the Trump administration and his administration on almost every issue. So the transition is significantly less important than this time. And I would again bring up the example of 2000 when George Bush lost 37 days of transition time because they would not cooperate with his incoming administration during the litigation that Al Gore carried out, and they still hit the ground running. So I think that, the whole canard about the transition is being damaged, therefore the national security of the country is being damaged. If Joe Biden doesn't know what he's doing and what he wants to do, then we elected the wrong guy.
What are your thoughts about the comparison to the year 2000?
It's not a particularly apt comparison. We had one state, it was an extraordinarily close state, 500 and some odd votes. It absolutely took a long time to figure out what was going on there. There are multiple states involved here. Every one of them, Joe Biden is leading in none of them is enough fraud alleged that would change that, even if it happened. And I'll agree, right? No election is 100% perfect. We're human beings. There are always going to be errors. But there is nowhere that the error level is alleged legally and appropriately to be large enough to make a difference. On the transition side of it, there in the post 9/11 situation, the commission did point to the slowdown in the transition as one of the factors in why we might have seen what we saw in 9/11. I don't know that that's absolutely the case, but it never helps to slow down the process of moving from one president to another.
All right, so Michael, I'll give you the final word before I let both of you go. What do you think the coming days, weeks are going to hold vis-a-vis this entire election and the way it's playing out, right? Because in a country that is right now, and we can admit this, whichever side of the aisle we may be on, that is this polarized, this isn't doing any favors, is it?
It is polarized. It's going to remain polarized. There's no reason to think that Joe Biden's vague promises about unification of the country is going to take us anyplace. They treated the Trump administration for 4 years in a certain way, and the Republicans are going to treat Biden for a certain way, and Biden's going to react that way. So there's no chance of unification as I see it. I just think that, we're looking at a continuation of a very difficult time for American politics. And it's going to continue, and I don't see any resolution on the horizon. There's a Republican control of the Senate. Joe Biden is going to have to get anything he wants to do absent executive order through the Senate. Senate Leader Mitch McConnell is certainly not going to roll over and play dead. The two of them did not get along that well when they were in the Senate together, so there's no reason to think that they would have a warm relationship now. I don't think it bodes well for the country, and I think that what we will see in the next several days is a slow unraveling of the Trump defense to the point where ultimately over the next 30 days, maybe faster than that, probably faster than that, the litigation route that he's pursuing collapses as being unviable, and then we will move forward.
I believe there's a final word, but we appreciate both David and Michael for their insight today. David speaking there from Newark, and Michael speaking to us there from Washington, D.C., giving their opposing views respectively on this issue. And it's important because I think it's a huge disservice to this discussion about the election and how it's played out to only talk about the fact that Joe Biden has won, projected to have won, of course. And that's an important point to certainly bring up, but it's also important to talk about the concerns on the other side, because whether we like it or not, there is a huge group of Americans who do side with the Trump administration, do side with his claims of voter fraud, and that needs to be dealt with because, as Michael there said as well, if Joe Biden is then confirmed as president-elect, then he needs to be able to also lead those people. Will he, in fact, be able to unite them at all? I mean, it's doubtful in such a polarized country, but it's important for him as then the president to at least try to do that, because he's meant to be leading all Americans, not just Democrats. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to continue to discuss the United States, but we're going to hone in on Donald Trump's immigration policy. Now, as we know, there was a time when children were separated from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border, and the effects of that have still continued till today. Now, the estimates say that around 666 children at this point in time have been separated from their parents, and their parents, they have not yet been found. Those families have not yet been reunited. And some of these children have been away from their parents for a very significant amount of time by now. This is, again, all down to the Donald Trump immigration policy. The worry is that a lot of the parents are, of course, back in their respective home countries, and that they're going to be very, very hard to find at this point as well. The Donald Trump administration walked back part of its immigration policy, I believe, because of the courts, but is not seemingly doing enough, at least within the context of a pandemic as well, to be able to get these children reunited with their respective family members and parents. Why were these children even separated is, of course, an important argument as well to put forth. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined by Ediberto, Román, who is a professor of law and director of immigration and citizenship initiatives at Florida International University. He's also editor of Citizenship and Migration in the Americas series, which is at the New York University Press. He's joining us this morning from Miami, Florida. Ediberto, good morning to you, and thank you very much for joining us here on Scope. What do you make of let's begin with the zero tolerance immigration policy of Donald Trump. What did you make of that policy to begin with?
It's consistent. It's consistent with Trump's administration from the point he was a candidate. If we all recall, going down his golden escalators, so to speak, and basically demonizing and creating an otherness of the immigrants, badly needed immigrants in this country. When you think about the labor force, but remember he called Mexican immigrants to the effect of they're not bringing their best, they're rapists, they're drug dealers, they're criminals. This is consistent with that policy, and he implemented it with an executive order essentially within a week of taking office. There was a memorandum that spoke to the effect that the U.S. was going to do everything possible to limit migration into the United States from its southern borders. So it was no surprise. Certainly inconsistent with prior practice, but no surprise.
And what do the laws say about this? I mean, the international laws, and I imagine American laws, do not allow for children and parents to be separated in this fashion at the border?
The question is, when we think about U.S. immigration policies, it's three pillars. We think about it from an economic standpoint, encouraging immigration there. But historically, the other two pillars have been deemed to be the most important, and that is humanitarian in terms of asylees, and also family unification as a historic policy that was there to essentially support those seeking to come to this country, consistent with the ethos, right? When we think of America in terms of the Statue of Liberty. But Trump, right, to appeal to his base, sought to demonize another, to scapegoat a group that has no constituents, right? Asylum seekers and those seeking to become migrants in the United States because of the interest in the U.S. for the labor force. So in terms of its legality, it was resoundingly rejected by the domestic and world community upon learning of it. Well, what is fascinating is the administration was coy with respect to it, actually denying that the children were being separated initially until ProPublica published the actual reports and of interviews, not interviews, but tape recordings of children, right, screaming and crying in terms of their state they were in. It's the most horrific policy that I believe the United States has had, unfortunately, since Japanese internment and the Americanization movement associated with Native Americans in the context of the late 1870s, where there's child separation as well. I would not think this sort of policy would happen again, but unfortunately, this administration, which is aberrant, frankly, to other administrations, Republican and Democrat, that didn't have this sort of policy. But we know that Trump has denied this, and in his last debate with Biden, accused the Obama administration of building cages and essentially starting this program. It's inaccurate, completely inaccurate. They wanted to be so vicious and cruel to deter immigrants. What they did was severe human rights violations.
Let me move on, Ediberto, to the issue then of what happens now that Donald Trump is going to be leaving office, and that's of course according to all the projections at this point vis-a-vis the results of the U.S. elections. There's a lot of talk about the kind of accountability he will have to face once he is out of office and out of the White House. Do you think that this will be, i.e. the immigration policy, the separation of children from parents, et cetera, will be one of those issues that he will be held to account for in the courts, possibly?
Well, I think it's conceivable. I don't think it's likely, but in truth, in my recent article on the matter that's going to be published in one of the Harvard law journals, I argue that international law should be a basis to at least investigate and maybe charge the president with respect to this. Realistically, I don't think it will succeed. And a fact of the matter, even if it does, I don't see a scenario with extradition. But this policy, and as I've written in op-eds and other settings, I consider the Trump administration's most abominable act. It was indefensible, especially when one considers that many of those that were separated were not only migrants seeking jobs and work, and that interest was reciprocal in the United States. When you think of the fields and sectors of the economy, such as labor, construction, and agriculture, these are jobs that others don't do, and I call the business sectors free riders in this setting. Not that this doesn't occur in other places, but in terms of resolving the U.S. immigration policy, we shouldn't be demonizing undocumented workers or often the critical elements of the economy. But at the end of the day, what we saw here was something so atrocious that he'll go down in history for his heartless act. So I think there'll be condemnation. I don't foresee investigations in the U.S. vis-a-vis that. But his problems in the U.S. more deal with financial matters and a long history of non-disclosure that the Attorney General's office in the state of New York is investigating and will continue to investigate. In terms of the international community, I think you'll see condemnation, and there should be grounds to investigate this. At the end of the day, I don't see much coming of it, though.
What do you think happens to these children if we may go back to now the core issue that we're discussing here? Because 666 children right now separated from their parents. Their parents are probably, of course, likely back in their respective home countries. They'll be really hard to track down. I mean, I imagine this is a very complex system. This is more of a headache than anything else that the Trump administration itself created, right?
Well, frankly, I think what we're dealing with here is, callousness coupled with ineptitude. When we look at this from the onset, over 2 years ago, within months of the policy being initiated, a federal court judge enjoined basically a technical term that says stop the government continuing the policy. And the Trump administration almost immediately thereafter announced its end. But yet, as you point out, right, over 2 years later, we're still seeing, right, almost 666 children, right, still separated from their family. So I think it's a logistical nightmare. It's a nightmare that should have never occurred, frankly. And to the extent that they did do it, it is shocking that there was no tracking or tracing of the parents as well as the children. Many groups are involved in the American Civil Liberties Union, as well as other not-for-profit groups, non-lawyer-based groups, are trying to assist the government in this effort. Very difficult in doing so because these people were deported to several countries, and I suspect, given the ineptitude in other settings, there wasn't a great deal of tracking. So we have a horror story of children, still many of them in detention centers. Not long ago, there was an order by a court judge to order their release in light of the pandemic. It is a true tragedy of errors in terms of what is going on. I have great faith in the Trump administration doing anything, but I have much more faith in the Biden administration bringing the country back to its norms in terms of immigration and, frankly, decency.
Very well. We'll have to leave there as a final word, but we do sincerely appreciate your time this morning, Ediberto, and for your expert insight on this issue of this immigration policy of Donald Trump, because, there's so much to unpack here, right? And so much of it was so shocking for the rest of us around the world looking from the outside in that the U.S. was even capable of putting innocent children and even innocent men and women into cages, even elderly included, and then separating children from their parents. I mean, the inhumanity of it all is genuinely quite shocking. Now, the argument always has been to secure the homeland and all of the above. I'm sure there are ways around that to do that in a very logical and humane fashion. But to have separated children in this fashion, to have denied that it's even happening, as Ediberto there mentioned, it all just, again, defies logic completely. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Iraq, and we're going to hone in on the issue of IDPs, or internally displaced people. Certainly, there are a significant number of them. I believe around 6 million had originally left or fled their homes during the conflicts, and several conflicts, of course, in Iraq. Firstly, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and then secondly, the fight against Daesh or ISIS. As of right now, there are about an estimated 1.3 million who remain displaced at this time, and the Iraqi government is seemingly forcing all of the above to go back to their areas of origin and is shutting down IDP camps. The Norwegian Refugee Council has warned that around 100,000 people will possibly become homeless very, very soon. Now, this is all also within the context of a continuing pandemic. We've had, vast corruption in Iraq ever since the downfall of Saddam Hussein in those many years, and all of that trickle-down effect certainly still very much exists in Iraqi society. And certainly, as I said, the pandemic, not only the health issues with that, but also then the issues of an economic crisis, which we're really honestly seeing worldwide as well. Is this the right time then for the Iraqi government to be shutting down these camps and forcing these IDPs essentially out onto the streets? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Mohammed Hussein, who is Policy Director at the Iraqi Center for Policy Analysis and Research. He's joining us today from Sulaymaniyah. Joining us from Baghdad is Dr. Ali al-Bayati, who is the official spokesperson and member of the Iraqi High Commission for Human Rights. And joining us from Dubai is Aveen Karim, who is the Middle East analyst at Analyst. Aveen, Ali, and Mohammed, thank you to all three of you for your time today. Mohammed, let me start with you. What do you make of this sort of policy on the part of the Iraqi government to force these people out of the camps?
Thank you, Waqar, for having me, and it's good to be with you and the other guests. So, if you want to understand the whole issue in its right context, so we basically need to see the whole situation from the broad picture. So Iraq is facing very dire financial and economic crisis due to the oil price down and the COVID-19 or problems associated with the COVID-19. So it seems Iraqi government cannot support those camps anymore. So ideally, or generally speaking, helping the IDPs go back to their region and to their hometowns and villages is something good, and it should be encouraged. But the problem is, there are many reasons for those people are still being displaced. They are still in campus. Some of them lost all their livelihood. Some of them lost their homes. And we have in Mosul, we still have some neighborhoods leveled with the ground, and they're still destroyed. A lot of villages are still destroyed. And many of those people who are still in the campus, they cannot just go back and start over again from scratch. They need some financial help. So that's what makes some of them actually became displaced after they will leave the campus. So the problem is Iraqi government couldn't help them return to their region of origin or villages and towns before this crisis. Now it pushing them and it forcing them to go back to their hometowns and villages. Well, it cannot support them. It cannot give them any financial aid just to return their livelihoods. Plus, we have also problems of armed groups and militias. In some areas, those people as returnees, the IDPs returnees are still denied. Some of them has actually security problem. They're perceived as supporter of ISIS, or they have some family members involved with ISIS terror activities. So they cannot return to their home villages and hometowns.
What are your thoughts on that? And certainly, I don't want to take away from the challenges that the Iraqi government faces, but is this the best solution at this time?
I think, as my colleague mentioned, it's a good idea, of course, to end this portfolio of IDPs as a long-lasting one, because we are going to enter the year 7 of its establishment. And of course, we cannot leave it forever, but it should be first a voluntary one, not forced, as it seems to be. Second, there must be some arrangements in the original residence area including the security, stability, safe livelihood for those families. The presence of houses and infrastructures, as well as real guarantees that they will not be subjected to some social or tribal revenge or retaliations. As expected, of course, because we know that some members of those families who were affiliated to ISIS have committed some crimes against some other communities or neighbor communities. So, talking honestly, we do not have a real transitional justice basics till now. So I think all these points not achieved now. The problem that we are getting such steps at any time before the election. So we are in doubt, or we are scared that it is a portfolio that always exploited politically, not from the humanitarian point of view. So, of course, pushing them back in such way without securing the area from many aspects, economically, socially, from security aspect, of course, it will be just pushing them to be a new seeds for terrorism in the future or for security and stability.
So now what I'm understanding from our other two guests is that, you know, the challenge is really insurmountable in this case, right? At some point, because not only are we dealing with just a financial crisis, which may have, you know, been made a lot worse because of the pandemic, certainly, but even before that, then there's also the issue of, as our other guest mentioned, that some of these people may very well still be affiliated to ISIS or, sign on to their ideology, and then there's issues wherever they come from, i.e. their areas of origin and infrastructure not being in place there. This is a huge challenge, isn't it?
Yes, it is indeed. And the issue here, I think, is more that if these IDPs are returned to towns which are not secure, because what the Iraqi government is doing now is it's trying to move to a post-conflict time in which it can work on development and reconstruction, but it should first work on the reconstruction of these cities before forcing IDPs out of the camps and back to the cities where they come from. The risk here is that there is a risk of even further displacement and even further marginalization. And this is what causes instability. So by moving these IDPs back to their hometowns, where they do face a lot of stigma because they might be affiliated or related to former members of ISIS, will cause a huge marginalization problem. And in these communities, which are predominantly Sunni Iraqis, it causes the risk of even further sectarian tension and even more mistrust among these communities towards the government. And that's something that the government really needs to work on at the moment. The biggest risk is essentially the security risk, because you have a lot of checkpoints through which these IDPs need to go through in order to return back to the cities where they come from. These checkpoints are typically controlled by popular mobilization forces, and they also require security clearances to pass through them. Now, these security clearances are difficult to obtain if you are related to ISIS members. So that causes the risk of even further displacement, because as we've seen in the last few weeks, the IDPs have not even made it home to the towns where they originated from. They end up being displaced on the outskirts of various cities, and these cities, the places where they seek shelter, lack clean water or even access to electricity. So I don't think the main issue is that the ideology might exist among these communities. The risk is that if they go back, then that's when they might become sort of radicalized again.
So, Mohammed, from what you know, does the Iraqi government actually have like a formal plan in place about what these people are meant to be going back to if they go back to their areas of origin, which were largely destroyed or damaged because of the conflict with ISIS?
The problem is Iraqi federal government and all the other institutions that were in charge of the reconstruction process in the war-affected areas, they actually failed in fixing a lot of the problems that we were expecting to be fixed like years ago. They failed to fix the local security problems in some sub-districts of Salahuddin and Nainawa, and even in Baghdad and Anbar, that still prevent IDPs to returning to their homes. So all the problems are still there, and we still have the entire neighborhood leveled with the ground. A lot of the war affected, like homes and let's say like livelihoods of many of those people are still destroyed. So without fixing this problem, is the Iraqi government is like actually forcing them to go back to their areas of origin. So that would not lead to returning those people to actually their hometown and home villages where they were before the crisis and before the ISIS war. So they push them to find very unsafe and cheap places in the edge of the cities and towns, like let's say in Mosul, Baghdad, Erbil, and other places. So that's what increased the risks of like being affected with the COVID-19 and being attracted by the radical armed groups. We still have a lot of organized radical armed groups, including Daesh and ISIS, and they still operate in the country. So there's actually a big threats and concerns about the radicalizing.
Okay, Mohammed, I'm going to come in just because we have under 2 minutes left. So I do apologize for cutting you off. I wanted to give the final word to Ali and Aveen as well. Ali, in just a minute or so, if you can tell me on this issue of those who are going back or who are being forced to go back to their areas. In your opinion, what would be a good solution at this time on how to handle that situation?
Yeah, the good solution to secure the original residents, as I mentioned, from many aspects. The security, number one. I agree with my colleague Aveen that most of those families, even some survivors, we had some cases of survivors who already released by security institution, they now detained because they have their names enlisted within ISIS documentations. So there is a real security problem. I think the main problem that why the government thinking to end this portfolio, because the international support or the supports which was coming from the international community, it started to end. So there is no any other resource to support them. So arrangement, the area or the residents from security aspect, from economical aspect, from social, and starting to implement the transitional justice, including reparation and accountability, are the main basics to start and ask them to return back.
And I'll give you about a minute. On that issue of the international community support, that's actually an important aspect, right? Because if we're saying that there's even the slightest possibility that because of these people being put into a very desperate situation, which is not of their own doing necessarily, that they would, that they would be in some ways welcomed by radical groups of any sort, be it the ISIS or others, then it's in the interest of the international community to in fact continue supporting these IDPs, right? Continue financially supporting and also logistically supporting them?
Yes, definitely. It all comes down to being able to financially support the IDPs, because if they are moved back into areas where ISIS continues to operate, because ISIS is still very much present in areas of the central and northern of Iraq, they would be susceptible to being recruited by armed groups if they don't have any other financial option or any other means to sustain the families. The most difficult thing here is that it's quite gender-based as well, because there are a number of widowed women with children among these IDPs. And so this is when it's down to these organizations to ensure that these women and these children are reintegrated into society, because a lot of the children that were born under the Islamic State were not even registered, so they don't even have access to education at the moment to go to schools. So there needs to be some sort of rehabilitation in these areas.
We'll leave it there at that, but we do sincerely appreciate all three of our guests for their time and for, of course, their expert insight. That was Aveen speaking to us from Dubai, Ali speaking to us from Baghdad, and Mohammed speaking to us from Sulaymaniyah. This is an important issue, right, because it actually affects the rest of the world as well. We keep saying, as the American president and many, many other politicians around the world says, ISIS has been defeated, but it's not just a magical wand, right? We've had major effects on innocent people because of this fight against ISIS, and they need to be treated well. They can't then be mistreated, even if they're family members of ISIS members, simply for that connection, if there's one to be proven. These IDPs cannot just be sent out onto the streets or into their areas and just for everyone to expect that magically everything will just be put into place somehow without the government doing its part or the international community doing its part to ensure that they are not then welcomed into the hands back again of ISIS or any other quote-unquote radical or terrorist groups. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.